The remark. Okay, people, see us talking. I want to do another section on Black history. And I'll give credit to Chancellor Williams. This is a section from his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. If anyone doesn't have that book, they need to get it. I don't mean get it from the library, I mean buy it and read it at home. Okay, so this is about the Mossi. The remarkable Mossi. They never called it an empire. They called it the Mossi states. We let it go at that. But it was in fact an empire if the same definition is applied as in other areas of the world. It was a union of kingdoms, similar to other core groups whose expansionist proclivities create empires. It differed markedly in the pattern of centralized authority. The traditional African political system of local autonomy was maintained in the independence of the individual states that made up the empire. There were 5 core kingdoms: Ouagadougou, Yatenga, Fatagurma, Mambrusi, and Dagomba. Each had become a kingdom independently of the others, each as powerful as the other. The union of these states was inspired by the bonds of kinship and common Mossi origin. Although located southward between the great arms of the Niger River and almost surrounded by the expanding empires of Mali and Songhai, Nai was able to subdue and bring the Mossi within their empire. Quite the contrary, the great and most dashing cavalry forces in Africa, the Mossi carried the war to them. The Mossi is another case study because it is also a typical example of migrating blacks who united to form new and larger political entities, conquered the people whose homelands they invaded, and at the same time showed wide cultural variations while holding steadfastly to the fundamentals of African constitutional principles. They are reflected not only in the political organizations of African states, but also in the conqueror's respect for the land rights of those whose original homeland it was. In short, the rights of conquest did not include ownership of the land, a fundamental constitutional principle. I want people to remember that passage for those who keep talking about the South Africa. Oh, well, it was empty, or whatever. I have emphasized the difference between the two main types of migrations: the slow and almost leisurely movements of people over countless centuries, because there are no longer tolerable conditions of climate and soil, and the stepped-up migrations amounted to a refugee flight. Because of increasing invasions from Asia and Europe, it is these latter causes with which we are now dealing. They increased as the Arabs overran the eastern Sudan, and became a period of crisis between the 12th and 7th centuries. This was the long period during which migrating blacks undertook to form a new and stronger states all over the continent, succeeding while other refugee blacks found themselves in areas where just to survive at all required all the energy they could muster for day to day. Progress? What progress? How progress? Blessed then were the migrants who, unlike those, found territories where progress was possible. Blessed were the Mossi. By 1500 they had become a dominant power and one of the most industrious nations of the period. The Africa-wide concept of the basis for legitimate rule was held to as a means of social control and national unification, as well as the basis for all authority, high or low. As elsewhere, it all traced back to the founders of the nation, in this case, Ouedraogo and Ubri. You could also take the parallels of that and liken it to Rome. Romulus and Remus, who founded the city of Rome. They had the Nam, the God-given power to lead men. All their descendants should inherit this power and therefore inherit the right to rule. Implicit in this, or certainly in this, the ideas developed from it, was the right to conquer and rule. The idea of royalty evolved from the same source, further illuminating how a fact and commendable idea, such as honoring the founders of the nation, may be elaborated from time to a grand old myth. But in Mossi land, the Nam seems to be carried to extremes. Everyone seeking recognition or even a minor office claimed to have the Nam. This bestowed the title of Naba, I ruler, so-and-so. The extent to which the political structure was based upon the Nam made Mossi society somewhat unique among African states. Since the Naba of the 5 core states claimed equality and were all fiercely independent in both spirit and action, the early contests were over what state should become the leader of them and provide the Mogo Naba, king of kings. Ouagadougou finally won, although he was not senior in the line of descent, in the Nam line of descent. It won because it had become the center of economic activity and therefore national prosperity. Because the Ouagadougou people outdid themselves in screaming praise songs for their Naba, who was the ruler of the whole world, his dominions were boundless. He was God's son and therefore sacred. No one must look upon his face. All must prostrate themselves before him. Supreme justice can only be found in our Mogo Naba. All this was too much for the overstates to overcome. The Ouagadougou Naba thus became the Mogo Naba, of the united Mossi kingdoms, principalities, and chiefs, each of which was virtually autonomous. The Mogo Naba had no real authority outside his own Ouagadougou kingdom. Unity was achieved through negotiations, friendly persuasion, or all else failing, sometimes by force of arms. More national unity seems to have been achieved, however, because the various states voluntarily follow this successful example of Ouagadougou in social, economic, and political organization, and the ritualistic splendor of a court that claimed rulership of the world. The political structure did not vary from the traditional African constitutional system. The village chief and council, district chief Naba on council, province governor Naba in council, and Mogo Naba on council. The Oidi Naba, prime minister, was next in authority under the Mogo Naba. Each important minister in the national government was also the Naba governor of a province, another variation of traditional practice. There were other variations. Some were highly important. One was the minister of Muslims, for unlike so many African societies, the migrating Mossi had learned something from the history of the blacks in their relations with Arab and Berber people. No foreigners could settle in Mossi territory, but since the Mossi themselves were great traders, they needed the far-flung outlets which the Muslims everywhere controlled. Muslim traders were therefore admitted into the country under the strict supervision of the Ministry for Muslims. All Muslim activity was restricted to trade. The religion of Islam was rejected, conversion to both teaching and religion forbidden. In short, the Mossi saw Islam and Christianity as a white man's vehicles for conquest. It was the only black nation in time to see this. Indeed, Mossi prophecy held that when the first white man appeared in the land, the nation would die. That time had not yet arrived. The Mossi policy of excluding whites or religiously limiting the number and controlling the activities in the country further illuminates an African experience that is already so clear that it should require no additional light. All African states that began to develop again after the great dispersions, rebuilding and expanding, were prosperous and advancing as black states as long as they barred the relentless, aggressive whites from their countries, and the destruction became certain only when they abandoned this policy and let the Asians and Europeans in. On this the record is entirely clear. The Mossi held on steadfastly to their own African religion and African institutions and survived over 500 years into the 20th century until it was finally overrun by France. A few more of these all-African institutions should be mentioned to further illustrate the external influence school. We are dealing with a land and a people where a white base would have been a curiosity, and white influence, even under the guise of religion, was barred by law. Few things could be more remarkable in the history of the black people than the rigid adherence to a body of principles that indicate a humane and spiritual level of advancement that pointed the direction to real civilization. One of these was reflected in the Mossi conquerors' recognition of the principle that no matter how powerful the conquerors of a territory might be, the land belonged to the people whose homeland it was. They were recognized as the rightful owners of the land, and therefore negotiations for settlements of newcomers were carried on with the chiefs or priests of the earth who represented the indigenous people. So you see, they didn't go in like savages and just kill people and take their land. They negotiated with them to put people on the land. Unlike, say, in America, where they just turned up and said, this is ours because you are not Christian, and if you're a Christian, well, we want it anyway. Their political system, high democratic, was unsurpassed by any state anywhere in the world. The system was developed by Africans. The family was the smallest socio-economic and political unit. The extended family council, for example, settled all cases involving offenses by members which affected only the family or were not serious enough to be carried to the village court. Bad behavior by one member was a reflection on the rest of the family. The Western creed of fierce individualism had no place in the society. What did was either a credit to his family or a dishonor. The village council was the next political unit with an elected headman and a council of elders. The elders were representative of the various family sections or wards that made up the village. The village council was the center of authority, subject to the will of the community. The districts were the next and larger divisions, varying in size and having many villages and towns. The district Naba chief was a very important official. Any number of districts made up of provinces and kingdoms which formed a nation. The great the Namse, plural for Naba, were elected by the representative councils and subject to their will. This latter fact was generally well disguised by ceremonial phraseology, ritual, and autocratic sounding decrees from the throne. Indeed, it was a general practice for both the council ministers and the people to proclaim that the Mogul Naba has all power, is the most powerful king in the world over which he rules. These fictions seem to be one of the delights of the people. For did not these fantastic claims help to make the Ouagadougou the Mogul Naba? Indeed, during the periods African societies were most democratic, every effort seems to have been made to make it appear that the supreme power was exercised by the rulers, never by the people. Upon the death or the removal of the Mogul Naba, for example, there was a constitutional fiction that his successor must be chosen by the Oidi Naba, prime minister. And the Oidi Naba made the public proclamation of all the ceremonial pomp and splendid ostentation befitting one charged with such an awesome responsibility. The Oidi Naba were merely announcing that an election had already been made by the councils of state. In addition to these councils of various local rebel devils, the Mossi developed another way of controlling the behaviors of rulers. This was the practice of moving from one unsatisfactory village or district to a more favorable one. Whole villages might move from one district to another. No district chief could afford this direct reflection on his ability to keep the people basically voting with their feet, the most important of his inauguration oaths. It also tended to undermine the economy of his area. The question of absolutism in traditional Africa is interesting because it so often means the very opposite of what is understood by the term in Asia and the West. In 7 different societies covered in my field studies in different regions, all declared that traditional kings had absolute powers as rulers. Follow-up analysis revealed that what was meant was that chiefs or kings had absolute power to carry out the clearly understood will of the people, which is, of course, a far cry from self-assumed absolutism. There were no absolutism in Western terms. Even Shaka of the great Zulu Empire complained because the council had failed to check him in his excesses. He expected some control and guidance. This control was not attempted by a council overawed by his greatness as a leader. As indicated elsewhere, my studies show that factors such as the Zululand nation helped to explain the decline of ancient African democratic systems. Asia and Europe were not responsible for everything that happened adversely. The Mossi became the outstanding horse-breeding country. The finest, swiftest breeds became their specialty. It was probably from this fact that they had dashing cavalry forces that so often carried them to the victory and protected the land from conquest for over 500 years. There was a great demand for Mossi horses and donkeys. These became an important factor in one of the most economically advanced countries in Africa. We turn next to their economic enterprise and the prosperity that flowed from it as still another explanation of what black people can do on their own initiative without the aid or even having seen a white man. Okay, I'm just going to take a break and I'll finish the other in a second half of the second video. Just take a break and relax peacefully.